Welcome to today's event, jointly hosted by the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations and the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath. My name is Nick Pearce. I'm Professor of Public Policy and Director of the IPR Institute at the University, and I'm delighted today to be joined for this event by Professor Loraine Whitmarsh and Pete Dyson here at the University for a masterclass on how behaviour change evidence can improve policymaking in practice, and with a particular focus on environmental and transport policy. We're going to look today at case studies of what works and what doesn't work in behaviour change and its implementation in public policy, and the insights from behavioural sciences, from social psychology and other disciplines into policy design. Professor Whitmarsh is Professor of Environmental Psychology at the University of Bath, Director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, does a lot of work on behaviour change and climate policy in particular, and advising governments, advising civil society organisations and others on how the insights from behavioural sciences, psychological sciences can be introduced into policy making. Pete Dyson is a behavioural scientist at the university, a doctoral researcher, and previously was principal behavioural scientist at the Department for Transport, where he established a new behavioural science team. So two great speakers for us today. What they're going to do is Lorraine and Pete are going to give their presentations one after the other, and then we're going to have a Q&A where you can feed questions in. Please do so in the Q&A function, and then I'll go through those questions, sift them around, and put them to Lorraine and Pete to answer in the final section of the session we have today. So be ready and be primed to ask your questions. Please note just a few things on housekeeping before we get started. Your cameras and microphones will remain switched off, so just post your questions in the Q&A. You won't be able to do it in the chat or through a microphone. The session is being recorded and we'll make it available online as a podcast and a video, which you'll be able to find on the IPR website. So thanks very much for joining us today. And I'm now going to hand over to Lorraine Whitmarsh to introduce and start the session. Lorraine.
Thanks very much indeed, Nick, and thank you everybody for joining us today. So I will share my screen. We've got some slides to show you as we talk through our presentation. So hopefully you're seeing that. So yeah, we wanted to give a bit of a sort of a double act really in terms of some of the academic literature around behaviour change, but also some of the work that goes on within the policy context in terms of applying that. So a sort of more practice-based view. And so I'll give the more academic perspective first. And I guess it makes sense to start off with some of the theories of behaviour. Now, I'm just going to slightly terrify you with this. Behaviour is complex, is the message I'm trying to convey with this image. Now, this image comes from the Foresight project that the government ran a few years ago on obesity. So they were looking at mapping all of the different influences on obesity. And while I'm sure you can't see any of the detail, you can maybe make out some of the blobs that represent some of the major categories of influence that span everything from individual physiology through to food production systems and consumption, social psychology, individual psychology, and then the physical environment as well. So a whole range of different factors that shape our diets and the extent to which we that manifests in obesity or not. Now, that's hugely complex, and that's very difficult to actually then make sense of. So where can we intervene in that system to actually change behaviour? But it's worth at least just putting out one option for how we might present some of the influences on behaviour. Another one comes from also another Foresight project that we were involved with, which was trying to map the influences on travel choices in particular. And this was the Future of Mobility project from 3 or 4 years ago. And here we simplify things a little bit, but there's still a bit of complexity. At the heart, the blue blob there are two of the major types of travel choices that we might face, which mode of travel to use, so whether a bike or a bus or a car, for example, and then whether you choose to own a car and which type of car you might choose. And those choices are influenced by psychological factors, motivations, like how much does it cost? Is it going to be a pleasant journey? Will I have flexibility, and so on? but also unconscious factors that we might not be aware are shaping our decisions, but we know through research are, like social norms. What's the normal way of traveling? What would be what are my friends and family doing, and kind of what implicitly is the right thing to do, and what does this type of car say about my personality? So there's symbolism and things that might be conveyed through a particular choice. So those sorts of things are maybe more psychological factors. But then sitting behind those, the green blob might be things like, how much money have I got, my income, how much, what are my various caring responsibilities and roles, which mean I have to take children somewhere or an elderly parent somewhere. So those sorts of travel mobility needs and circumstances and so on, and where do I live, will be driving many of those sort of individual level factors. But then, and I always think this should be a bigger blob really, the transport environment is the orange bit at the top, which is all of the physical environment, the urban design, for example. So how much space is there to walk and cycle? How attractive is it? How quick is it to go by? That means how regular, frequent, etc. are the public transport services where I live, the cost of those things, and so on. So lots of things captured within that fundamentally shape our behaviour as well. And really one of the key points I want to make here is that our attitudes are really only one influence on our behaviour. So it's rarely enough to just motivate people to change their behaviour and say it would be a really good idea to reduce your carbon footprint. You have to enable people as well. You have to provide the physical and economic and social environment that enables people to make those choices as well. And this is why it's worth saying as well that we often act differently in different contexts. So we might do one thing in the home and something perhaps quite different at work. So we've seen, for example, in terms of energy saving behaviours, recycling behaviours, that you might do those things at home, but you may well not do those things at work, perhaps because the physical context or the motivational factors are just different across these different locations. So where does that leave us? Well, how can we reduce down this complexity in a way that might then shed light on how to intervene? One of the common theories of behaviour that we use a lot is the theory of planned behaviour. And that's what you're seeing here. And it basically says there are three main types of influence on our behaviour. And the first one is attitudes. That's what do I think? What do I think and feel about something? Do I think this is a good idea? The second category is subjective norm, or also called social norm. So it's really, what do other people do? What's normal? What do other people think I should do as well? What's the sort of the feeling about the right thing to do within this situation? Those are sort of social influence factors that are also very important. And then the third one, perceived behavioural control, is to what extent is it actually possible to do this, or how easy is this to do? And these are the sort of pragmatic, logistical, maybe physical factors, like, well, there just isn't a bus service where I live, so that's not an option for me. So those three main categories of behaviour shape our intentions to act, and then in turn our behaviours. One big caveat with this theory, though, while it's very parsimonious, it's quite simple, so it reduces that complexity we've seen so far, is that it's not that accurate. So actually meta-analyses that have used this suggest that it only explains about 25% of the variance in behaviour. So it's not great. And partly that's because not all of our behaviour is intentional. So quite a lot of the time we do something that completely bypasses conscious decision making, and it's very habitual. It's just driven by the fact that we always do that in this situation, and so the context is cueing our behavior, and it's not an intention. So that's one caveat here, is intention isn't always the route to behavior. Nevertheless, there's a lot to be said for the three main ingredients here, which do represent some of the major drivers of our behavior. I wanted to include this because it's a very different view of behavior. What I've shown you so far is coming out more from psychology. From the more sociological literature, there tends to be a focus less on the individual and the decision-making processes of the individual, and much more on the context in which behaviours emerge. And so it takes a much more sort of structural approach, and and behaviour is seen as emergent out of the sort of properties of the context. So social practice theory says there are basically three sort of elements of a social practice, which sort of is a behavior, but it's a socially recognized activity. So it could be showering, for example, is an example that you see here on the right. And so showering arises because of three elements: materials, that's the physical environment, and technologies come in here. So it's, do I have a shower? And is there water supply coming into my home that provides hot water to enable me to shower? So that's the sort of materials element. The competences bit is another blob. That's like, do I know how a shower works? And am I familiar with this technology? And it's not a very sophisticated technology, so it doesn't require very much in the way of competence, but it does require some knowledge of how a shower functions. In other contexts, there may be more know-how involved in using a particular piece of infrastructure or technology. Meanings is the red blob, and that's the sort of social, cultural norms and symbolism and beliefs that might accompany a particular practice. And what comes out of the work on showering in this literature is that showering isn't just about getting clean, it's about waking up, it's about feeling fresh, it's about preparing yourself for some activity. So it's gone beyond just a functional, I don't want to smell, to actually having a wider set of sort of meanings and so on. And some of that, you know, is maybe links to the way in which marketers sell products linked to showering and so on. So that's quite a different view that sees these things as interacting, and it's not a linear process of one causes another, but actually these are interlocking sets of influences on our decision making and our behavior that cause or give rise to something like showering or driving or cooking. Another way of looking at this is trying to sort of group together these different influences in a way that might be more tractable to policymakers. And so I wanted to include this as well. This is the COM-B model, which you might have come across, which stands for capability, opportunity, and motivation. Those three sets of factors are thought to predict behavior and interact with each other. And you can see the similarities with some of the things I've already shown. The capability that came out from the social practice theory. Opportunity is part of the sort of materials that we've just seen, but it's also that perceived behavioral control. So it's the physical and social environment. Can I do it? And then the yellow bit is all the motivational or the attitudinal type factors that we've seen as well from the first model. And there is a two-way interaction here. So behavior can feed back into some of these things. So I might try something and that might reinforce my motivation, for example, to keep doing something. So there's an acknowledgement that it isn't necessarily a linear process. There's some feedbacks there. So this is actually quite widely used in policy circles. So and it forms the basis of a lot of interventions. So I think it's worth having this quite centrally in the rest of the talk. But I want to move on now to thinking about, well, how do we change behavior? If we think about behavior change being potentially starting a new behavior, stopping an existing behavior, or increasing or decreasing the level of an existing behavior, what are the sorts of interventions that we can apply? And really it's about thinking about these different sets of factors that shape our behavior. How can we play with some of those levers? So I've mentioned the COM-B model. Well, if you this that you see here is the behavior change wheel that Mickey and colleagues have developed, which builds on the COM-B model. So at the heart of it, you see capability, opportunity, and motivation. All of those factors that we know are drivers of behavior or sources of behavior, as they're called here. And sitting around that are various types of interventions, from persuasion and education through to restrictions, environmental restructuring, training, incentivization, and so on. And then a sort of set of policy categories that might be sort of more familiar and group together some of those things around that. And essentially, you can hopefully sort of see that there are a whole range of levers that could be used that kind of address one or more of these different sources of behavior. So, for example, motivation. If people don't know what to do, or they don't know why they should do it, maybe they don't see the benefits particularly of changing their diet, we can give them information. We can highlight the benefits of dietary change, and maybe we can show them which behaviours are the most effective. So to give you one example from a national trust menu that trialled putting CO2 information against different items on the menu, you can see that the lamb stew has a much higher carbon footprint than any of the more vegetarian-based options on the menu. So if you were concerned about climate change and wanted to reduce your carbon footprint, you could adjust your choice based on that information. And so that might be quite influential. But what we do know is that usually those sorts of information provision approaches by themselves aren't usually enough. We need to do wider things. And so in the top right here, you see a picture of a cafe where potentially there is an opportunity there to actually restructure that context to make plant-based options more available, more attractive, more prominent, maybe change the price of those things so that people are much more sort of nudged towards those plant-based options in a way that doesn't even necessarily mean that they need to sort of deliberate over information about the impact of those choices, but they're presented in a more favourable way. So that's sort of gives you the sort of, there are a whole menu really, excuse the pun, of different options for changing behaviours that come out of that behaviour change wheel. And I rather like this way of distinguishing those different intervention types into downstream versus upstream. And the behavioural insights team uses a similar sort of typology where downstream relates to interventions that try to influence people's choices directly. And usually this is through information provision, whether that be labels or advertising or campaigns, or more structured sort of education approaches, or maybe social influence could come in here too. Here you're trying to intervene at the individual level and change individuals' decision-making processes. Upstream interventions are where you're trying to influence the context of action. So actually make desirable choices cheaper, make them more available, maybe remove less desirable choices altogether, and change the built environment potentially as well to sort of enable people to change their behaviour. So you've got economic measures, regulatory measures, and so on coming into this sort of approach. And really what I want to highlight is that by themselves, downstream measures tend not to be very effective. So there was a recent meta-analysis that suggested they were about 2 or 3% effective in changing behaviour. This was specifically looking at low carbon choices, whereas upstream measures could be completely effective. You could completely remove an undesirable behaviour if you wanted through upstream measures. Ideally, I think it's worth saying you want to combine downstream and upstream, because we need to inform people about the sorts of upstream measures that we might want to implement as well. So there's likely to be a downstream element of information provision whenever you do some sort of effective upstream measure to bring people with you. But yeah, by themselves, downstream tends to be less effective. And there is, it's worth saying, a huge literature on how to do downstream interventions well. So this is sort of information campaigns and persuasion. We know we need trusted sources, for example. It matters who's telling you that information. They have to be seen as credible. They have to be seen as somebody who is like you in some way. So trusted sources. Your message needs to align with what your audience cares about. And so at the moment, for example, people are very concerned about their wallet and cost of living. So can we reframe what we want people to do in ways that highlight the economic benefits to the public? But of course, publics differ. So different concerns or values might be emphasized to different segments. We can also use social influence processes and social norm-based messaging. So if we tell people that actually most people are recycling, then that can help persuade people to think, oh, this is normal. Actually, if I'm not recycling, I'm not doing what most people are doing. So people like to conform to norms, so that can have some effect. And we can alter the way in which information is framed to be more positive versus negative. In the environmental context, there's a sort of history of using fear quite a lot to try to scare people into doing the right thing, because there are so many environmental risks that we need to address, like climate change. Well, we have to be very careful with fear, because it can disempower and demotivate people. We have to, if we use any sort of fear, we have to accompany it with a sense that people can address this risk effectively. So a sense of self-efficacy, I can do something about this. And so in the health context, that has worked to some extent with smoking campaigns. You can scare people, but you have to give people the means to address that risk. More effective tends to be positive messaging, where you're motivating people to move towards something desirable. And so actually there are health benefits or financial benefits to doing this thing. So positive messaging is more often than not tends to be more effective. And targeted information is also more effective than blanket campaigns or mass information provision. So we can target information at the time and place when somebody is making a decision, and that could be putting a label on a product when they're choosing a particular product in a consumer situation, or maybe putting stickers on light switches, for example. So at the point at which you're doing something, provide information. We can give people feedback, for example, smart meters, energy meters that show you how much energy you're using at a particular time, means that energy information is then much more useful than if you give people a bill every 3 months or 6 months. They can't translate that into a specific action that they've taken. You can target information to the specific needs that somebody might have. So the specific route that they need to travel from their home to their workplace. What are the low carbon modal options for that route? And so door-to-door marketing can be helpful in that sense, making specific individualized travel plans. And then we can also recognize that people have different values as well. And so we can emphasize different benefits of action, or tailor that information to different sorts of values or beliefs that people have. That segmentation approach has been very effective in marketing. And this is one example of that, actually, from a study where, sort of classic marketing study, where they were trying to look at how to market bottled water. And so you can see here the 3 experimental conditions that they had. The top one is the control group. So they just showed the brand name of the product. The second group were told, this was supposed to be the personal benefit group, that you would feel good if you consume this product, so it would refresh you and it would make you more alert, etc. And then the bottom group, this was the environmental benefit, where more of the environmental benefit was emphasized. They were told it would reduce landfill through using less plastic in their bottles, which is probably a bit tenuous with plastic water bottles, but anyway, that was the third group. And basically what they found was that consumers who had stronger environmental values found the third type of messaging more effective than the other ones. People that valued personal benefits over environmental benefits found the second message more effective. It was more effective in increasing adoption of that product. So we know that segmenting audiences can work, that actually tailoring information can make it more effective. And I've touched on this, but this is an example here of how social norms can also work to change behaviour. So in one quite classic study, they wanted guests in a hotel to reuse their towels in order to reduce water and energy use by the hotel. And they put these signs in bathrooms saying, in one group, 75% of guests in this hotel use their towel more than once. And then in another condition, they just said, please reuse your towel. And what they found was that this one that you see here, saying that most people do this, was far more effective than the standard just asking people to do it. So yeah, people do conform to social norms, and that can work. And speaking of social influence, people are influenced by the people around them, and particularly people that they are close to and people who they see as similar to them. So they're close social networks. We know, for example, from the work on adoption of low carbon innovations and other technologies, that there are neighborhood effects. So if you live in an area where other people have got solar panels on their roofs or have adopted an electric car, you are more likely to adopt those innovations. It's because people like you in your community, in a similar living situation, have got this technology, it works for them. So you're sort of seeing this could be something that works for you. So that influences your decision making. So there are physical proximity can be a factor here. But in other contexts, there have been interventions which kind of bring together groups of households, kind of similar people, maybe friendship groups, and create sort of eco teams. And they basically try to compete to reduce their carbon footprint over time. And they're sharing information with each other. So they're trusted sources. They're saying, well, how did you reduce your waste? Well, oh yeah, so tips from each other. But also there was this kind of this support and this comparative and competitive element as well, that people wanted to kind of do better and improve over time. So that had a durable effect, but obviously there's a question about how scalable that is. And it's also worth saying it matters when we intervene in these sorts of ways. And this is a big area of research for us at the moment, is on moments of change, because we know that actually it can make a big difference when you try to change behavior. A lot of our behavior is habitual. So we're often on autopilot. If you think about your journey to work in the morning, probably you don't think, how am I going to get to work today? You just use the same mode of travel and probably the same route that you always do in that situation. So it's the context itself is sort of triggered, got to get to work, I'll jump in the car or I'll get on my bike. So you've bypassed that deliberate decision-making process that I mentioned at the beginning, that is often assumed in some theories of behavior, and it's a habit that's driving your behavior. And that means it's very difficult to change that behavior, because you're not engaging, you're not thinking about all the different options open to you. You're not thinking, oh yes, well, there is a discount on the bus and so on. So people tend to ignore information about alternatives when they have a strong habit, and that means it can be difficult to change those behaviors. But when habits are disrupted for various reasons, and that can be when you change job, when you move house, maybe when you have a baby, when you retire, or it could be COVID, so wider societal disruptions. Those sorts of times of disruption make brilliant opportunities to actually reconfigure people's habits, because people are sort of snapped out of their autopilot and they're actually thinking about, how am I going to get to work now that I've moved house, for example. So information and incentives and interventions become much more salient and influential. So in a classic study some years ago, they gave citizens in a German city some information about the bus service where they lived and a one-day pass to try the bus for free. And what they found was, amongst the people who had moved house in the last few weeks, that intervention over doubled the uptake of bus use, whereas amongst the people who had not recently moved house, they had the same intervention, but it did not significantly increase their bus use. So this is because habits were disrupted. It provided an opportunity for people to actually pay attention to this incentive that was given to them, and it worked much more effectively. But what I've been talking about so far is sort of broadly in that downstream sort of category. It's sort of people at the individual level thinking in different ways, but we know there are big barriers to behaviour change. As I've touched on at the beginning, attitudes by themselves aren't the only thing that shape our behaviour. The context is also really important. And the context captures things like social norms, and so is it normal to have a big house full of gadgets and to fly on holiday and to eat meat? Those sorts of cultural norms can be very difficult to sort of overcome. But there might be economic barriers. So the cost of low carbon options is often higher than high carbon alternatives. Convenience, physical barriers as well, like maybe there just isn't a public transport route where I live. Maybe there is no bus service, for example. So all of those things make it very difficult to translate even the best intentions into behaviour. So what can we do? Well, we need these upstream interventions that I've mentioned. And there are lots that fall into this category. Some of these are economic factors, economic measures. So there may be subsidies or charges or taxes or levies of various kinds. These are certainly one very effective category of intervention. We saw that last year in Germany, where they subsidized very significantly the public transport system as a way of reinvigorating the economy after COVID, but actually it also encouraging low carbon modal shift, and that was very effective. And a recent review paper showed that congestion charging is actually the most effective way of cutting car use by up to 33% in the case of the London congestion charge, and had wider benefits besides just reducing emissions. And that worked very well because it also provided money to improve the alternatives. So economic measures are a huge category, but in a slightly different vein, we can also change the defaults and make it easier for people to do the right thing. We know that people go with the status quo, they go with whatever is the default option. And so one way we can change behavior is just to change the default to be the thing we want people to do. And so with one particular example that was really effective was when a Swiss energy company shifted its 250,000 customers onto a renewable energy tariff as the default. And even though it cost them slightly more to have green energy, up to 90% of customers stuck with that default and didn't opt out to have the slightly cheaper fossil tariff. Whereas when they had to opt in to have the green tariff, only 3% did that. So that was increasing from 3% to almost 90%, and that was a durable change, is a hugely effective shift that just plays on this status quo bias that people have, that the default, they go with that. And then there are other things as well that come under upstream that really are about sort of regulation and supporting infrastructure. And this is about changing the options available for people, essentially. And so this could be in the transport context, reallocating road space away from cars and giving some of that space to cyclists and pedestrians, so that it means it's more difficult and less attractive to drive, and also safer and easier for people to cycle and walk. And we know that on average that can be very effective to reduce traffic. Similarly, low traffic neighborhoods, home zones, other things sort of come under this kind of physical infrastructure category that mean that people are encouraged and enabled to do things in different ways. And even just, it doesn't necessarily have to be about kind of physically sort of changing things, but even just increasing the availability of certain products and options can work. So an example was a really nice study where they doubled the proportion of vegetarian options in a number of canteens. Previously, it had been 1 in 4. They increased that to 2 in 4. So you could still choose meat if you wanted to, but you just had a greater choice of veggie options, and that increased plant-based sales by up to 80% in some cases. So these sorts of measures can also be very effective. I think final thing that I'll be saying, though, is that it's best when you combine interventions, because there are usually lots of different factors that shape our behaviour, lots of drivers and lots of barriers to behaviour change. And so we need a range of different measures, both the downstream and the upstream. And so we know, for example, that just making low carbon options attractive isn't enough. We also need to shut down or disincentivize high carbon options to break habits, but also to really shift those kind of incentives. This, just to give you one example, from a study on coffee cup reuse, when they just gave people information about why they should be reusing their coffee cups, that only changed behavior by 1%. When they added in various different other elements, including giving a charge on disposable cups, so you were charged more, and also giving out free reusable cups, that increased the uptake of reusable cups by 38%. So it makes a difference when you, like, bringing in more things can usually significantly increase the effectiveness. And another completely different example is from what we've seen in terms of smoking rates over the last few decades. That a majority of people used to smoke in 1950. We're now down to about 14%, and that's due to incrementally bringing in a series of different policy measures, from information provision through to prices, changing pricing through taxation, non-price measures like quitting services, regulation, and so on and so on. And so all of those things together has really enabled that behaviour to shift radically, and the norms around that behaviour to shift radically over time. But just before I close, I want to just make one final point, which is that people do need to be part of the decision-making process. And so where we are intervening significantly in people's lives, and we'll need to do that to address things like climate change in particular, we need to engage people and bring them with us. That's going to be critical for acceptance. And we can do that in lots of ways, from simply surveying people to find out what's important to them, to maybe bringing them in a more significant and deliberative way through things like citizens' assemblies, so they have a stronger voice in defining and scoping policies. We need to actually understand what's important for people, what might be the barriers to change, and to design policies with that in mind, because imposing solutions on people tends not to work. Moreover, that more participatory decision-making tends to actually improve the quality of decisions, because you know it's going to be workable, because you've addressed some of these maybe pragmatic concerns that people have. Oh, I did want to flag, before I finish, a recent report which I think is actually highlights a lot of the things that I've said, which is a report that came out from the House of Lords Environment and Climate Change Committee in late 2022. And this looked at the role of behaviour change in addressing climate and environmental goals. I was an advisor to this, and so kind of saw how the evidence was compiled. And I think it says some very important things, not just about how to achieve behaviour change, and which sort of emphasises a lot of the things I've said, that we need a range of different measures. For example, we need to bring people with us too. But it also very significantly criticised the government in terms of what they've done so far to enable that actually they conclude that government action to change behaviour in relation to climate environment has been inadequate, and there is a significant risk of not meeting our environmental and climate change targets as a result of that. So I do recommend that particular report for some quite specific and practical insights in terms of how to get behaviour change into policy. And that does contrast with the way in which behaviour change has been framed within a lot of the climate policy so far within the UK. So if you look at the forward to the net zero strategy, it really does sort of say we don't need to change our behaviour too much. We'll be adopting a few more technologies, but there is no need to sacrifice our quality of life or reduce demand. But I think, as we will see, that is not that does not match up with the scientific evidence of what we need to do. So I won't go through the recommendations from the House of Lords report, but it sort of emphasises a lot of the things that I've been saying so far. So I do recommend having a look at that. And I think these are questions that I could potentially have come back to in the discussion, but it would be great to hear, I think, from you about the behaviours you're interested in, where communication comes in, and where you think the sorts of interventions that I've highlighted might help address the behaviours you're interested in. But I'm handing over now to Pete, who's going to come and sit in my chair and provide a practical perspective.
Thank you, Lorraine, and hello everyone. It's great to be here. Yeah, I hope in the next 15 or 20 minutes I get to bridge some of this question of, the title suggests, how do we put the behaviour change evidence that we've just heard, which is a really comprehensive coverage of the different theories you could approach, and the evidence base, empirical as it is, or in different situations. When push comes to shove, what are you able to implement, and how are you going to do it? I could speak for myself here, but with some perspective, having worked at the Department for Transport in 2020 to 2022, for which the COVID-19 response was a very significant part of the work, as was sustainable travel behaviour change, and catalysed the recruitment of more behavioural scientists within the department, really in many ways bringing into line, along with other government departments that have dedicated behavioural insights, of course, social research and behavioural science functions. Before I start, I mean, I think there's some worthwhile perspectives and challenges that you face when, as I say, push comes to shove. You have to decide we can only necessarily do one of these potential measures. We can't do all of them. Which ones should we do? Which things should be prioritized? How will it affect different people differently? So distributed impacts. And even what would the effect of implementing one thing be on other policies that you might have? And indeed, with respect to COVID-19, how would a temporary policy be removed? Like, what is the exit strategy for a measure that can only be put in temporarily? So lots of things to think about. Here's a useful first step, though, which is to put behaviour change and behavioural science in its wider context. So behaviour change gives you a really cross-cutting view of the whole sets of influences on people's behaviour. So if we wind back to some earlier slides, we saw how travel behaviour be influenced not just by the person's beliefs or attitudes of the situation, but obviously also the quality of the transport provision, its affordability, its safety, the material factors of the person, any given individual can't really change. A cross-cutting role is really useful when you see there's different roles for different disciplines. So language differs here, but it can be helpful to think of social research, which is commonplace in many organizations, answering the critical questions of what people are currently thinking, feeling, and doing. And there are qualitative and quantitative sort of research methods that will get you a really good insight and depth into what they're doing. But then behavioral science is challenged to sort of say, so what might we do to better understand that from theory? So things that people wouldn't necessarily tell you, but insights across the psychological disciplines would suggest. And then how might we influence, how might we address some of those concerns? Intersecting with all of this is then evaluation, which is us trying to work out, has something made an impact or not? Who was affected? Where? When? Why? And what can we learn from this? And disciplines of evaluation obviously can exist without you needing to be a psychologist, say. You can set up quality trials with better samples and different experimental methods to work out whether something made a difference or not. And that's probably where the public policy research angle of this would certainly come in. Secondly, then, you need to say, if these are our questions or our ways of working, then what might our actual methods be? As I touched upon, social research can look at methods of qualitative interviews and group work and surveys of analysis and of public engagement and what is commonly called, can be called deliberative research. Behavioral science can bring to bear its models, as we've seen, and those models can be applied to looking at how we might optimize something, how we might take something that's already out there and try and make it better, or bring to bear and create new policies or interventions. Something behavioral science is well adept at, and I'll talk about in a couple of the published studies you could read more about, are online experiments. So in a time-constrained world where things move rapidly, online experiments are a way of testing policies and messaging conditions in a controlled environment you wouldn't be able to get out in the real world. And as I touched on, evaluation has a range of methods at its disposal. Let's go into a worked example. So if we cast our minds back going on 2 years, the outset of the COVID pandemic elicited a number of rapid policy measures from a whole range of different departments. One of these in the UK was the Fix Your Bike voucher scheme, where a £50 voucher was could be issued to people to get people cycling, knowing that there were restrictions and difficulties in providing public transport. So behaviour change is useful when we think about this framework at moving the set of, even early on, the set of objectives of what we're going to change. So the first objective could be, we just want to get people back onto bikes. We want to get people cycling. A more specific objective might be, we want to get broken bikes, so ones that are completely non-functional bikes. I think that's the typical aspiration, the ones that are in garages and sheds and backs of gardens. We want to bring them into the fleet and get them working again. You can then be more specific and say, we want to get people using those bikes for commuting and essential trips. So you could be more specific about them being valuable transport trips. And then even more specific again about saying, well, we want that use of that bicycle to replace for sustainability goals, to get people to switch out of cars. And I think this is helpful at setting a set of vision or a set of objectives that you can then work from and start using theory and models to describe what the diagnose what the barriers or drivers might be to any number of these given actions. When we look at the actual role that was to play, we looked at the website and the user experience and what you might call a journey towards getting a voucher, and identified using COM-B that there were some capability challenges in some of the design of the work of requirements to have where requirements were signposted for need to show identification, an ID, be that a driver's license or a passport, and official documentation in order to run the scheme as quickly as it was and get it out there. A third piece is really important on timing. And when you put theory into practice, you need to make sure the timing is right. And that can be about balancing different priorities. So on the left-hand side is a simplified research process where you might identify an issue, construct research questions, design work, go into field, analyze your data, report, make recommendations, and then it might not be the researcher themselves, but somebody else would take action. Well, on the right, currently is what policy professionals might recognize as ROMEF, which is the way in which a policy would need a rationale, it would need a set of objectives, you'd need to appraise those objectives and implement, you'd monitor what was going on, evaluate it, and you'd feedback. Well, it's really important that someone that's in a research role and generating evidence slots in at the right time. So you would want your recommendations to come in either perhaps be on hand and available when the set of objectives were being put in place. Or you might want your research to be timely to inform the other ongoing evaluation, or there might be a particular other report, a combination of measures that are going to come in at a certain time. When we think about this for the COVID pandemic, we cast our minds back now about 2 years. There was a self-isolation measure after international travel. There was a set of traffic lights that you needed to follow to know which country when you return from different countries, what the different measures would need to be. And there was different adherence to those measures. So you need to wonder what is preferable messaging and what in different circumstances might we provide as people land in the UK, before they arrive at the UK, when they're planning their journey into or out of the UK and back again. What can you say? Now, when you're putting theory into practice, this is where you can bring to bear the studies that I talked about earlier, and you can use principles like people's optimism bias towards their hopefulness that their trip will go ahead, their optimism that they will, when they land, be successful in being compliant with staying at home. But as the days go by, it can get tougher and tougher to stay at home, both for mental and physical and social reasons to stay isolated. You can also bring to bear evidence about people's perception of risk, both of them contracting COVID and also the general efficacy of their perception of risk, that they would pass it on, which is all to say these are different ways in which you can construct, and if you were to look at the study in more detail, different treatment groups and different messaging platforms to then test within an online environment, which can then be timely and be brought to bear at the moment of decision of saying what sort of messaging are we going to put out, and indeed how likely would people be to continue to be able to comply with self-isolation. And I think probably most importantly, ruling in or ruling out different measures. So if messaging proves to be ineffective, then does that mean that bigger levers need to be pulled to provide financial support, social support to enable people to stay at home? Fourthly, when we put theory into practice, and we have evidence available, it's useful to make a distinction between the findings, the relatively narrow findings of a study, how that study can be interpreted, and then what recommendations would actually come out of it. And I think there's often pressure that a study's findings, so what narrowly the results of a study say, and whether or not you can draw that out to say, well, you should or shouldn't do this. So if we bring to the previous example, an online experiment may demonstrate that one message is preferable to another, or it may show that within that environment you can see a certain effect size, but that's then difficult to then say that whether it's conclusive and whether it should direct or support a particular course of action. And I think that's where the interplay between research or an analyst function and a policy professional and then ultimately a decision maker comes in. And it's all the more important that actually methods are described clearly so that the uncertainties of a particular piece of research are understood and not misinterpreted. A worked example for this sort of thinking is the return of people to public transport as COVID measures or the prevalence of COVID eased, but there's still a great deal of uncertainty. A significant finding of studies was that social research studies was that people were generally actually slightly counterintuitively on aggregate in favor of face coverings for the confidence that they provided and the perceived efficacy that they had in reducing transmission on transport. You can think that there's another mental model that people might be applying, that face coverings signify danger, but as you saw with say Transport for London's decision to maintain face covering requirements, it was both for a precautionary principle of reducing the possibility of future transmission, but also as a way in which it provided some confidence to particularly vulnerable users. And of course, this is a behavior that is both individual but has collective benefits. So the collective gain of everybody being compliant with a face covering is much more significant than any one person doing something. In a study that was run on different messaging, I think there's a useful discussion, and again linked here for more that would like to read more about it, where you have legal requirements, and we did have legal requirements for, or you would face a fixed penalty notice for wearing a face covering. What messaging might you also put alongside? So if we think back to the Combi wheel, we've had legislation and we've had messaging. We are probably all familiar with the posters and billboards that reiterated the fixed penalty notice fine and how face coverings are a requirement on public transport. what was studied here was the role for additional messaging that pulled on different levers. Within an online experiment environment, found that the treatment group that was effective in changing face covering compliance was also a message that leveraged reciprocity and pro-social behaviour, which read something along the lines of thank you to the millions of people who are currently wearing their face coverings. And this goes to show that it's a difficult balance then that needs to be struck, say in the media buying, of what balance of messaging should you put out, where and when. So at the beginning, you may want to emphasize that something's a legal requirement, but that has diminishing returns. And over time, you might want to provide encouragement, enablement. There are other interventions you could imagine where face coverings were abundantly available at railway bus stations, so people always had one to hand. And it could go on and on like this, but it's to say, I think the wheel is a helpful way in saying there are complementary interventions to be had here. And that brings to a very nearly final point, that we can think of behaviour change and behavioural science as both a mindset and a specialist discipline. I think there's another worthwhile debate about how this goes. But in order to reach scale and in order to reach many of the professionals and roles that are involved in ultimately people doing things, it's useful that we have a set of basics that people understand, and they can engage and they can access some of the fundamentals. But there's also needs to be a specialist role, certainly for social research, to conduct high quality qualitative and quantitative research. But a social researcher would probably also want to be engaged with identifying behavior change issues, reviewing the evidence on what works and doesn't work, commissioning specialist research and being aware of current and changing theories. But as behavioral scientists, there's a technical knowledge in developing and advancing further theory, in prioritizing, in sort of critically applying these sort of second order effects that we might have of any given intervention. And for me, it's useful, and there are two useful points to be made here. One, I'm an admirer of the wheel, not just as a transport enthusiast, but also as a wheel as a way of it not being a priority, not having a set list, and enabling us to see that there's a range or a spectrum of different disciplines. Typically, any given acronym will privilege the first letter in that acronym, for instance. But I think COM-B does a remarkable job of saying there's a whole sphere here. But secondly, that we might think of behavioral science in a way that we also think about data analysis or data science and statistics. We readily accept that there's a minimum standard of numeracy and fluency in even just in descriptive statistics, so understanding the differences of different averages or different charts, but we know that there are higher level skills that are going to be needed on demand. And I think a really good future looks like people being even more fluent in fundamentals of behavior change and behavioral science, bringing that standard up at the same time as applying specialist skills where possible. And to tie this back to some points that Lorraine finished with on the net zero strategy, we previously saw the forward to that strategy. If you go deeper into what is a very long document, there are a set of 6 significant principles, and the heading is Principles Underpinning Green Public and Business Choices. We see the importance of minimizing the ask to send clear regulatory signals, the importance to make green choices the easiest, to make the green choice affordable, to empower businesses and people to make their own choice, to motivate and build public acceptability for major changes, sixthly and finally in the report, present a clear vision of how we'll get to net zero and what the role of people and business will be. As time goes by, I think there's pause to reflect on what is there, what isn't there. If there were a 7th principle, what would it be? And it's not for me to necessarily say what there is or isn't. But I do think, having been here, there's also another job to be done, which is how are these principles then communicated and put into play among the professionals that are in post at the moment and are facing a range of different decisions. Can they point to number 4 or number 2, or can they create policies and justify them in this way? So how do you operationalize these things that are put into documents? So that's something that's on my mind. But we finish there, and keen to open up for questions if we can.
Great, thank you very much, Pete, and thank you, Lorraine. Thanks for those excellent presentations. We've got a number of questions, and to those who've tabled questions, many thanks indeed for doing so. If we don't go through all of them, please forgive me, but I'll try to bring out as much as I can from the Q&A of the sort of salient issues that people are raising. I just want to perhaps start with the point you ended there with, Pete, which has come up in a question from Nat Rees, which is, how do you influence people to change their behavior when they are in organizations that have to make decisions? So organizational behavior change, if you like, where you've got a private company or a university or a charity where you want to shift behavior in terms of what the goods and services procured, sold, used, etc. in an organization. Perhaps we could address that question first, because obviously, as the question raises, there's often a lot of resistance, business as usual, path dependency that you're trying to shift in an organization. Perhaps we could tackle that one first.
Yeah, happy to. Really good question. And I think this is covered by organizational psychology, of how you get any particular message or organizational culture across. I think for this, I would see senior leadership or setting an example, a positive example, as a really, really important area, setting the tone for what constitutes positive actions within an organization, and providing a set of incentives that are consistent with that. No sense in saying something at the top, but ultimately people are driven by metrics that are quite contrary to that. And if you're starting out, then I think I've seen in my experience good effects in starting small and getting a smaller trial or smaller piece of evidence showing, of a case study showing applying this makes a difference in this way. It's tangible. Let's do more of it to build on those changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of the factors that shape our behaviour within other contexts like the home do apply within the workplace, but there will be institutional factors in addition to those things, and that might override, for example, things like, do I care about climate change? I do, but within my job structure, there's just no incentive to think about it in the decisions that I'm making, or that the physical environment within this office does not enable me to do that. So there will be sort of other organizational workplace factors overlaid, some of those things that we know to be relevant within other contexts as well. So yeah, that's a good question.
Great. Can I ask a question? It comes through a little bit in a couple of different questions, which is the sort of balance between waiting for or trying to incentivize behavior to change versus making a change, a regulatory or legislative or other change, which then sets a new social norm, which then provides a context for different kinds of behavior. You both touched on this in different ways in your presentations. The example given is often low traffic neighborhoods or congestion charges, where there's a lot of resistance to those when they're brought in, and then people accommodate and adjust to them. And the argument is often made, well, what you should just do is just make the change, and then you'll get public endorsement, legitimacy, and support for it later. But how do you address that kind of question in your work?
That's a good one. Do you want to start? Or?
I think you do.
It's not an easy one.
Yeah, we think about this a lot in our work, because with climate change, I mean, the net zero strategy is a good example because it's very explicit, going with the grain of consumer choice. There's no desire within that policy framework to really radically change consumer behavior. It's about kind of where there might be an emerging trend, let's just sort of maybe encourage that along a bit. But actually, we know we are going to have to make some pretty profound changes to people's lifestyles. And in many ways, people are on board with that, but in some ways they might need, we might need the measures to be put in place and then to sort of engage with people to promote sort of policy acceptability of some of those things at the same time. Yeah, absolutely. And you're right to point out that quite often people will resist policies that are proposed, and then what happens is they're implemented and then they see, oh, actually they are pretty good and they do improve air quality and they do, you know, I can get to work quicker. So the policy acceptance follows the implementation of the policy. So that can certainly happen. But this is where I did mention engagement. It is absolutely critical to understand why there might be some pretty legitimate concerns about policies. And we saw that with the Gilets jaunes in France, that these were policies that were very well intentioned in terms of, for example, reducing emissions, but actually they were not workable for significant parts of the population because they were not able to travel to work anymore. It was just not going to be economically feasible for those groups. So without a really thorough understanding of the differential impacts of different policies on groups and how that might be perceived as fair or unfair, for example, those policies are not necessarily going to be workable. So it's absolutely the case that policymakers can provide leadership and do quite ambitious things, but it does need to be accompanied by an understanding of how the public are going to be responding to those things and bringing people with you and engaging with you. So it's a difficult one. I don't know if you had any thoughts.
I come to mind a quote, which is, a principle isn't a principle until it costs you something. And there's a certain amount of perseverance that needs to come through when implementing principles. But I think you can use, I'm optimistic that there are some research methods available that could get a better handle over the public acceptability or tolerance for particular changes. I know that CAST last year, in a company with Ipsos, did really good work on looking at different public support for different policies. Now, some of the findings with that were that again, people will support green policies up to a point at which it costs them something. But there's more that could be done in maybe structuring in different policies or finding ways in which people can be amenable to change and more public engagement to continue the conversation.
Yeah, and I would just add as well, it's interesting that I think quite often amongst the policy communities, there may be an assumption that the public will oppose something when actually the evidence sometimes suggests the public are already there and quite far ahead in supporting some of those things. So actually low traffic neighbourhoods is a good example because broadly speaking, more of the public is supportive of those things than is opposed, but there's sometimes a very vocal minority that seems to sort of give the impression that, oh, this will never fly kind of thing. So it can be important just to dig into, like, to what extent would the public support this, and there may be more of a mandate for policymakers to act than is assumed.
Yeah. Can we just stay on this question of cost? We've got a couple of questions about the sort of costs of action. Pete just mentioned these, and in both of your presentations you touched on these questions. When the costs seem long-term and far away, that behaviour change is less likely than if the costs are more immediate, and the costs of inaction are more immediate. That people, particularly on when it comes to environmental change, but I think, well, that's for 2030 or that's for 2050, and policymakers are telling them that the targets are for 2030 and 2050. So they go, okay, I don't have to change my gas boiler just yet, or my electric car. Whereas if we were faced with a more immediate challenge and a more immediate requirement, and the cost to inaction was clearly high, would we change our behaviour more rapidly? And that's one sort of question. And the other related to that comes through in an earlier question, which is, and Lorraine, you touched on this in your presentation, is it problematic when people confront something in ways that is very, very fearful? So if they think that climate change is incredibly scary and fearful, that you're demotivated from action because it's just too big a problem, it's going to consume us all and there's nothing you can really do about it.
Yes, all good questions. You might have more to say on cost. I'm not an economist, but yes, you're absolutely right that if you present something as being something like distant, either in time or in space, then people will tend to sort of deprioritize that. So they do focus on things that are relevant to the here and now. But while climate change can certainly feel like something that is very distant spatially, it's happening, it's kind of for people in developing countries more than here, or it's for future generations to worry about. And there's some truth to that, but it is obviously increasingly affecting us in the here and now. We can also think about, when we know about the various motivations and drivers of behaviour that are relevant, that there are other things that are very immediate and pressing, like cost of living crisis, for example, or in some cases maybe health concerns and other things that are very sort of immediate for people, and then actually prioritise messaging and measures that focus on some of those wider proximal co-benefits of action. So in the here and now, this might be about energy saving that reduces bills and also reduces emissions, because yes, people are understandably worried right now about how they're going to pay their bills. So this is why we need to be emphasizing these wider benefits. And that does relate to the second point about fear, which is, I think, it only works in certain situations to motivate people, and you have to be very careful that you don't go too far into that kind of just apathy and demotivation and people feeling like there's nothing they can do, and so switching off. And so we've done a bit of work on climate anxiety, for example, and we know that while it's not sort of very prevalent amongst the population, actually, for those people that do feel very anxious about climate change, that can be a motivator to action, to do certain things to reduce their carbon footprint, but it can spill over into just complete sort of feeling powerless and unable to do anything. And so it is about kind of highlighting that there's a problem, but actually having a much stronger solution framing to the communications that we have. So say, these are things that we can do. These are things that people are already doing. This is how you can do these things. So really focus on the solutions much more, I think.
I will interpret the question, but I think there's a bigger point to be made here of treating people like average, shall I say. So where we talk about, say, boilers or fuel costs, there can be concentrated winners or losers to a particular policy. And one of the problems is that we don't have I don't think any country has a particularly great handle of the data on given households and different household segments. So some households bills look like very high heating bills, but maybe lower transport bills. Other households are very reliant on fuel and therefore very sensitive to fuel costs, but might be less sensitive to boiler and household heating costs. But if we could have a better picture of the different segments, we might be able to get a bit closer to saying, okay, you can make this amount of change here, but you're already making this change here. If we treat people like average, then we assume that everyone has the same opportunity and ability to make changes.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Pete. I've just got one actually that may be best directed to you in the first instance, Pete, which is from Jackie in Chew Valley, saying that they're withdrawing bus services, replacing them with DRT services. A lot of shock and anger about that, despite extensive discussion, consultation, Q&A, Facebook groups, etc. And I suppose this is just a question about when you've got a very big change like this in modal shift, which affects a community. What can be done to get people to take up the new service, accept that the change is coming, where, I mean, you talked earlier about the sort of messaging that you might engage with when you're dealing with the public, or when the use of public transport, modal shift, face masks in your earlier example. So just a very specific point there about when you are completely changing the mode of transport, in this case bus services, in ways that you think will be beneficial in climate terms, but there's a lot of shock and anger, I think are the phrases used there by Jackie.
Yeah, and that shock and anger might be based in some calculated and reflective difference in the service provision. I don't know, I must say, I haven't scrutinized them, but it will also, I think it's fair to say, be looked at the not just what it is, but what the risk and consequences is if it doesn't live up to standard, because we're talking about people's lives here. So it's not just necessarily, it's not just a bus trip, it's an ability to access employment or to provide caring responsibilities or to do any number of things that are meaningful and important to people. I think I would agree that you need to go beyond, say, an online experiment where you you present different propositions, because there's more to it than that. Ideally, you'd be able to trial DRT, but you can't really trial this sort of, for people less familiar, sort of dynamic dial-a-ride minibus service. You can't really trial it alongside an existing bus service, because your users will need to pick one or the other. Having engaged a little bit with the politics of or around the West of England area, I think the Metro Mayor Dan Norris is trying to lead the way and saying there is a certain leadership and trust element of saying this is the technology, we've evaluated it, we're bringing it in, come along with us. But yeah, I see how much needs to be done there.
Great, thanks, Pete. Lorraine, can I ask you a question that's come up at the end here from Emma, but I think it's also in some other questions as well, same sort of insight, which is the role of autonomy and the sense of autonomy and self-determination in behavior change. So, if you like, the sort of the caricature of nudge is often that you're applying nudges because people are irrational, they take shortcuts, they employ heuristics. They're not actually acting in rationally autonomous, self-determined ways. And yet a lot of theory would tell us that actually people value agency and autonomy, and they actually, engaging with them as autonomous agents is incredibly important. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. So nudge can be an effective tool in a toolbox, and it's attractive to policymakers because it doesn't take away choice very often. It just sort of enables people to, it just sort of, well, nudges people. It just does things under the radar to facilitate people making better choices. But it doesn't work in all cases, and particularly where we're working in climate change, the amount of change that the amount of transformation that we're going to need in order to reach net zero it's going to be very explicit. It's going to be very disruptive to people's lives. It's going to challenge on various cultural norms around consumption and quality of life and sort of aspirations that people might have. It addresses issues of fairness and so on. So if we're really going to actually do this properly and really cut our emissions profoundly and rapidly, we're going to have to need to engage with people at a very conscious, explicit level. And this is why I touched on things like citizens' assemblies, those more sort of deliberative democratic processes that bring people in to more actively shape policy than simply kind of, here's a policy, just consulting sort of relatively late on in the process. So I think that's quite profound, but also we need this wider. And so one of the things that I mostly, there are lots of things I don't know about the net zero strategy, but it did say that we do need to have to communicate to the public a vision of where we're going. Ideally, that vision would be co-created with the public so that we're sharing actually something that we all want to be moving towards. But actually, I don't think there is that sense of like, where are we going with this? What are the changes going to be required? What am I going to need to do as part of this? There is an assumption it's all going to happen on the supply side with a bit of tinkering here and there. Technology is mostly going to fix it. But actually, that's not really true. So we absolutely are going to need to engage people. So once we've got that shared vision and that sense of engagement, then some of the nudge things can be slotted in. And so we could use defaults because we know they work in certain situations, but they're not going to work for lots of things like getting people out of cars and onto buses and things. That's so you can't nudge people onto a bus service if it doesn't exist. So there are going to be lots of other measures that we're going to need, and we're going to need some pretty explicit consent for that, I think.
Yes, and that presumably picks up the point you ended with when you said government strategy can't just pretend that this will all happen through the market or happen through us, not changing our behavior very much in non-threatening ways. There are some things where we have to be completely upfront and address the challenges that we face. And as you say, there are democratic mechanisms for doing that available to us. Can I ask about just, again, it's come through in a number of different questions in different ways, and that's about the sort of speed of change. So climate change, incredibly urgent now. The science is telling us every year, that it's getting more urgent that we take the action in the short term to address climate change, and whether there is anything in the literature about forms of behaviour change that are sort of more or less, not just more or less efficacious, i.e. between 3% or 100%, but which happen at speed and scale. So are there certain kinds of behaviour change intervention which can have a rapid effect and perhaps also a bigger scale? Or are they just legislative and regulatory, those? I mean, is that just a matter of, stopping people?
I think those tend to be very effective and in a fairly short time frame, basically. But we struggle actually to answer that question effectively, because we try to look for exemplars of how can you do this quickly, because I gave the example of smoking as to how you can have a really big shift in behaviour, but it is over like 50 years or something that we've got from lots of people smoking to not very many people smoking. And so that was an interesting sort of, this is the sequencing of kind of ramping up to sort of regulation ultimately after doing lots of other things first. But we don't really have the luxury of time in this case to wait 50 years before we get to that stage. So we're going to need to compress these timescales for sure. And if we're going to build in this kind of engagement, deliberative stuff, we can't just do things without engaging. So we are going to have to build that into the timescales. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. I think that is going to be a challenge, how to do this quickly and democratically. I don't know if you've got any sort of good examples to hand as to where that might have worked a bit better.
I was only reflecting on changes that have happened in our recent past. I was looking at statistics the other day. In the past 15 years, smartphone penetration has gone from something like 4% of UK adults to now 93% of UK adults. And the fastest growing group are the over 55-year-old category. So if we cast our minds back, it wouldn't have been a webinar then, but it might have been an in-person meeting. Devices that we have in our hand do have an incredible power. Obviously, they're connected, they change people's travel behaviors, they give you live routing information, you can travel anywhere at a moment's notice. They provide some entertainment and use while traveling. I'm just thinking about if you were to, in 2008, have mandated or set an objective that over 9 in 10 adults would carry what was then mostly just an iPhone in their hands, they might have balked at it, but it became pretty popular pretty quickly, and it has changed a lot of our behaviors, not always in ways in which we would find desirable, but that's technology in many ways.
And that brings us to the questions of tipping points and when policy can enable tipping points to take place. Peter, I wonder, there's a couple of questions about policymakers and change, how you change their behavior. You've been a civil servant, you've worked with the politicians, and you talked towards the end of your presentation about what makes for a good policy development process in terms of the evidence you marshal and how you present it, and the options and the costs and benefits of different options that you appraise. But have you got any advice for people on sort of thinking like a politician or a policymaker when you're presenting evidence and argument that gets the sorts of change that you want to see?
Yeah, good question and a fair one. I have had an insight. I won't diminish everything, but I've had a relatively short insight into this world, but enough to probably see that many decisions need in this organizational structure to be defensible, and it's significant that you need to say, there's a sort of expectation of sort of cause and effect, that I've made this judgment because on balance this evidence or this set of reasoning. So to empower or enable people to be able to do that, and that is about providing the quality of evidence that you can say this was an experimental design that is strong enough to say, we know enough now that we can do this and not that. I do still come back to the importance and responsibility of communicating evidence in a fair way and a transparent way, both the evidence that you might collect in as primary research, if you're a policymaker, you commission various research, or the sources of data that you're using to make decisions, and that might be acquired by some other agency or data source.
Yeah.
Just
Great, thanks,
I mean, there is an evidence base on on this in terms of the political science. We had our policymakers make decisions, and I don't know it very well, but I certainly know that the quality of evidence is important in terms of shaping those decisions, but there will of course be things like ideological factors, relationships, and so on that will be so much more important often. And so this is why we kind of see, no matter how many times we present the evidence that behaviour change is needed and we need to reduce demand, it just goes completely counter to the ideological sort of filter within sort of central government that is like, well, we just can't go there kind of thing. So just the best evidence presented in the best way doesn't always get translated, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think we could do a whole other seminar on the political science of these things and the political economy of them too. And as you say, there's an extensive literature about these sorts of questions. One final one, Lorraine, if I may, which is just Peter Allen asking about the Chris Skidmore's net zero review and whether there was enough about the role of behaviour change in meeting net zero targets in that review, compared perhaps to the House of Lords report that you were an advisor to.
Yes. I thought the Skidmore review was actually really good, I have to say. There was a really big chunk of work on behaviour change within there. There was stuff on engaging communities as well as the business community and others. And it recognised a lot of the things that were said in the House of Lords review as well, and in the wider evidence base, really, about the need to not just communicate to the public, we do need to do that better, but to enable and to really remove the barriers to behaviour change and to provide much stronger incentives and regulations and various other things too. So there was quite a strong focus on, I think, the built environment and energy use within homes and so on. But nevertheless, the key message was government needs to go way further than they're currently doing to enable behaviour change. So there was, and it emphasised those co-benefits. So it really talked about not just the economic co-benefits, but like health co-benefits, community benefits, various other things that actually suggest that, you know, there's lots of reasons we should be doing this, not just to reduce emissions. So yeah, I thought it was very good, actually.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Lorraine. Thank you, Pete. We are just about out of time. I want to thank everybody for attending the seminar today and for all the fantastic questions. I think we had 37 questions, which is great. And just before we came on air, the government announced that there would be a new department for energy and net zero being created. So Whitehall has got a new focus on these issues, and so this kind of discussion that we've been having today, the evidence marshal for public policy change, now has, as it were, a new locus in Whitehall, which I'm sure we can all start to think about in the weeks and months ahead. But thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Do stay in touch with the work of both the Centre CAST for Climate Change, Social Transformation that Lorraine is the director of, and also with the Institute for Policy Research, my own institute. Do stay in touch with our work. As I said at the beginning, we will post up a podcast and a video of today's presentation. So lots of the references you'll be able to see in the slides and everything that was made available today. But of course, if you have any questions, do get in touch. I'm sure we'll be able to reply to them. So thanks very much to Pete and Lorraine. Thanks very much for great presentations. Thanks to you all for joining us, and we'll call it a day there. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.